Like this show and want to make your own? Let me tell you about Anchor. It's free, and they have creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. And now you can even add any song from Spotify directly to your episodes. The possibilities are endless for what you can create, whether it's music analysis, your own radio show, or something the world's never heard before. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. And you can also make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. So download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
Hi, I'm Kim.
And I'm Felicia.
And we're from the Harry Potter Revisited podcast.
Each episode is based on the next chapter in the series.
We make inappropriate jokes and crass comments along the way.
Check out Harry Potter Revisited on iTunes, Stitcher, or your favorite podcast app.
Bye, Felicia.
Hi, welcome to the Vocal Fires podcast, the podcast about linguistic discrimination.
I'm Megan Figueroa.
And I'm Carrie Gillen. And today we have our second guest, Dr. Peter Jacobs.
Hi, Peter.
Hot squile to me.
Hi. Peter Jacobs is a professor at Simon Fraser University, and he works on language revitalization. He's a speaker of Squamish and also Kwakwala, right?
Yeah.
Very excited to have you on the show. Also, I have known Peter for 20 years. So that's when I first started working on Squamish as a very young 21-year-old undergrad.
And Peter, you're also a member of the Squamish Nation, right?
Yes.
Yes, that's also important.
All right.
So today we're going to talk about a bunch of different things, a little bit about Res English, a little bit about Indigenous languages spoken in Canada and the United States, language revitalization, just whatever comes up, but those are our main topics. So yeah, let's just start, I guess, with Res English. So why did we want to talk about Res English or Indigenous languages? Well, first, because we barely talk about it in the wider culture. In fact, we kind of ignore Indigenous peoples, especially in the United States, completely.
Right.
It's almost like they're gone. Right. So we're going to talk about people that still exist,
right.
Damn it, still speak different varieties of English, but also different languages. All right, so what features does Res English even have? Because if you think about it, it's people from all over the North America, excluding Mexico, that have originally and still do in some cases speak a different language. So what are the shared features in common?
Just like anything, I think there's regional Res Englishes.
Yes.
Because I come from two different language groups in BC, I know the Res English of these two different areas. And my first story is I was down in Arizona a number of years ago with my cousins from Squamish, and we met a relative of mine who lives, from my mom's side of my family, she lives in the Phoenix area. And so we hadn't seen each other for a while, and we start talking. After we're done and we left, my Squamish cousin said, "Wow, did your English ever change when you and your cousin from North Vancouver Island started talking?" So I was never aware of how different they were, and I'm not exactly sure what all those things are. But
Right.
So you say that you can speak two different Res Englishes?
Yes.
Do you find yourself code switching then, so you know when you're doing it? Do you speak them at certain times? Are you conscious of it at all?
I've become more conscious of it as I've gotten older, and I think that was one instance where I really became aware that people noticed my Res Englishes. But my nephew now, who's like a young adult, and we were up on the North Vancouver Island with my mom's side of the family, and he was just commenting because he actually has another Res English from even further up northern BC, and he was doing this really insightful analysis of how people talk in all of these different situations, and I thought it was really quite brilliant as a young person. But he was at the advantage of having three, not just two, plus standard English.
Yeah, I like what you're saying about your nephew because it reminds me that everyone's a linguist in a way. Um, when we can call ourselves linguists, but it's I think a term that can be applied to anyone that uses language. We all notice these things because we all speak it or sign. We all have language, so I thought that was very cool.
I think one of the defining things is probably some type of intonational patterns that people
Yes.
use.
Mm.
And I don't know enough about intonation to say what they are, but if someone really exaggerates it, and we do sometimes really exaggerate it, I think that's what it's really picking up on, is this certain styles of intonation. I don't know if that's interplay between, our parents or our grandparents' first language or what. I've never gone that far to find out.
Yeah, the very little research that there is seems to suggest that, at least in the United States, it has to do with people coming from different languages and learning English together. And so they all have the same intonation pattern.
Okay.
And they call it a contour pitch accent. And since I also don't know that much about prosody and intonation, I can't replicate it at all.
And it was them coming together to learn English in horrible conditions, being boarding schools, correct?
Boarding schools
Right.
here in the United States and
Right.
residential schools in Canada. And yeah, they are horrific. So
Right. So this forcing of English on speakers of other languages, trying to eradicate indigenous languages.
Right, trying to beat the Indian out of them, for example.
Right.
Yes, literally and figuratively.
Right. Peter, did your parents go to were they in boarding schools? That's a thing in Canada as well?
Yes.
Yeah, they're called residential schools.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. I think most of my aunts and uncles and my parents and some of my grandparents went to residential school. My mom's first language was Kwakwala, and I don't think she learned English until she went to school. And one of my grandfathers, went to residential school, and he ironically also learnt Inslakatmuk, which is the local language of where the residential school is, which is like a interior Salish language, and he was the speaker of Squamish. And he also learnt English. He used to say, though, that they beat Jesus into us one day of the week, and then they beat him out the other 6.
Wow.
Oh, God, that's horrible.
Oh.
Yeah. The Lord works in mysterious ways.
Yes, that's what that quote means. I get it now. Oh.
An interesting thing I was just thinking about lexical items. People like Squamish, like this southern part of BC, and also in Washington, and I found out in Oregon, we all use in it. And we all say it similarly, in it. And I think, what's his name from Spokane? He has it in his books. It was in Smoke Signals.
Oh, Sherman
Alexie. And when I went to see Smoke Signals and the characters were using in it and they were using it perfectly right, I just broke out. I actually was like hysterically laughing in the theater because I'd never seen anybody speak Res English on the screen. It was always this kind of people always did this kind of stilted English that was supposed to be like, Native American English or something like that. But this is people really speaking like how we do today, and it just cracked me up.
Don't you even know how to be a real Indian?
I guess not.
Oh, shit, no wonder. Jeez. I guess I'll have to teach you then, ain't it?
That movie actually had good representation of Res English.
Yes, yeah.
It did? Okay.
Well, because
yeah.
Evan Adams he's really from here in BC, right? And
Yeah. He's a local boy.
Yeah.
And what is an example of in it, like in a sentence?
People say that it comes from "isn't it," and I guess it probably does at some level.
Oh.
But
okay.
someone says something. Someone did something kind of stupid, and you're all kind of laughing at it, and they go, "In it."
Okay.
Yeah. Obviously, I don't know how to translate it. In it.
Yeah, it's difficult to translate.
Yeah. And when because I went to University of Oregon for 3 years, and I was part of the Native American Student Union, and there was a Navajo student there who had gone to boarding school in Oregon, and we were just sitting around in our little office there, our little space, and just getting to know each other. And then she just said it. She just said "in it," and it was so out of context for me. Like I'd never heard anybody, because my mom's side of my family up northern BC, they don't use it and they don't recognize it. But Yeah. It really is certainly a marker of being part of a community, and
Yeah.
it made me laugh like quite hard.
One of the other things that I noticed or read about is that, at least in some communities, the intonation used for yes/no questions, so yes/no questions are questions where the answer would be yes or no, like, are you hungry? In many Res Englishes, it would sound more flat, so are you hungry? Whereas most other speakers of English would say, are you hungry? But I think that's related to the fact that, at least in some indigenous languages like Squamish, the intonation is flatter for a yes/no question.
Yeah, it'd take me a while to do some introspection to think of, because you have to imagine yourself talking to someone that shares the same English, and then how would you talk to each other like that if you were trying to be on the inside?
How old were you when you learned Squamish?
Well, I knew a lot of words, like, individual words, but I didn't become conversant until my late 20s when I was working on a dictionary. And that took a long time because I was just doing elicitation of words and sentences, and it wasn't really a communicative context. And then students like Carrie and others came in, and they were also doing elicitation. So in a way, I was just saying to someone the other day, I became a speaker of Squamish through elicitation, which which is a fairly privileged position because I had the opportunity to do that, which most people don't. So
Yeah.
and it takes a long, long time to do it that way because the input is kind of one-sided.
Yeah. Are there any Kwakwala specific features? So like the init thing is sort of more Salish-y, I'm guessing. Are there any Kwakwala specific features that you have in your Res English?
Like there's things that seem to travel around, like it's generational things. Like people used to, not just Kwakwalas, but a lot of different Res Englishes had ne. Have you heard ne? Yeah. I don't use it, but I would recognize like what people are trying to say when they say ne. It's kind of like the generation below me, but it seemed to travel around, So maybe like some Res English things started to travel more as people were like having more contact with people regularly, and sports and, intermarriage and everything.
And to clarify for listeners, you do not have to speak an indigenous language to speak Res English, correct?
No, not at all.
And in fact, it's probably, unfortunately, the way that things are, there are probably more Res English speakers than there are also bilingual English and indigenous.
Sure, like for most of us, Res English is our first language.
Right. Yeah.
And then we learn like standard Canadian English or whatever. And
right.
French and stuff.
And then at some point you may learn your tribal language, but a lot of times that comes later in life for people. Is that right?
Yeah, things are changing, and a lot of it is there's a lot more going on than there was even like 20 years ago when Carrie started working with Squamish. So
yeah, now there's an immersion school, so kids
Yeah.
can
Oh, wow.
learn at least.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, tribal is not a word we use in Canada.
Oh, what do you use?
Nation,
So
I guess.
national language? If you're doing
Nation.
First adjectival
good question. Yeah.
First Nation language.
First
Yeah.
Nations language, I think you would say.
Okay.
Or if it's not First Nations, because again, if it's Inuit, they're not First Nations. They're Inuit. They're separate. So it's complicated. That's why I keep using Indigenous,
Yeah.
because
Okay.
it's a sort of a catch-all for a much larger group.
Yeah.
Okay.
Until we all fall in line, we're just going to have to wrestle with all of that, eh?
Oh, I see your Canadian English
Oh,
coming
yeah.
in too.
Yes, I also have there's a question about Res English, and I was having this conversation with Strang Burton. He said how it could very well be that Res English is a representation of how English was spoken many generations previously, right? So it's kind of like fossilized or being maintained or something in the community, because A is very strongly used on the Res.
Yeah, and less so in urban
Yeah.
areas in Canada.
Oh.
I use A sometimes, but I don't have the full range of A that Peter does.
Yeah.
I tried to teach
So
her, but
is
she just couldn't get it. Yeah.
It's true.
Is A more of a rural thing then?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good day. Welcome to the Great White North. I'm Bob McKenzie. This is my brother Doug.
How's it going,
Okay, our topic today is the Great White North because we got like lots of mail, about it,
Yeah.
Okay, so
By the way, this topic was my idea,
People consciously try to get rid of it to sound less rural because it's stigmatized.
Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah.
So what happened for me that changed me? When I might have gone that same route when I was living in Oregon. People were constantly picking out whenever I used it, and then it made me use it even more. So now I have it. I was a young adult then, and it stuck with me.
That's good.
Yeah.
You should be proud. You should be proud of the A.
Yeah.
I am.
I kind of wish I had it.
There's one other thing I wanted to say about Res English. I don't remember particularly who it was, but someone did a master's project looking at Squamish English, and they looked at the pronunciation of consonants and vowels and particular lexical uses of words and stuff like that. And what they found was, because Squamish people first learned English in the residential school system or through the church from French nuns and priests.
Oh.
So there's an influence of French English onto the first people learning Squamish, like my grandparents' generation,
Right.
Oh, wow.
earlier generation, and then later they were all Irish.
Mm-hmm.
So then there's an influence of Irish English on Squamish people's. So it's a very Squamish specific thing,
Wow.
and just because of the interaction of the Catholic Church and the different generations of how they sent out missionaries to our reses.
So if you can send me that master's thesis, because I think people might be interested, and we could post something about it on our Tumblr.
Mm-hmm.
Before we move on from the Res English, the smoke signals, I listened to a clip of it. Would you say that the I don't know, the tone, the way that he speaks is the kind of tone that you're talking about, or the intonation?
Yes. Oh, yeah. Evan Adams in particular, he just he worked pretty hard. He doesn't talk like that all the time. Like he's a doctor now, right?
Yeah, that's right. In Vancouver, right?
He's a medical doctor, and he has a big position in looking at Aboriginal health in the province and that. But
Okay, so we have like a really good example to put on a podcast so people can listen to.
Yes.
The kind of intonational patterns. Okay, yeah, I was listening to it, and it's definitely noticeable.
During the 60s, Arnold Joseph was the perfect hippie because all the hippies were trying to be Indians anyway. But because of that, he was always wondering how anybody would know when an Indian was trying to make a social statement.
To me, it sounds sort of kind of normal because, I've heard these accents my whole life. But yeah, I think it's really, really different if you're from here.
Yeah.
Because nobody really talks like that down here.
No, they did have some examples of Navajo speakers kind of having that intonational pattern as well. So maybe in northern Arizona instead of southern, we'd maybe hear it more.
Yeah. Yes, you would. Yeah. Speaking of Navajo, or Dene Bazad, as it's known in its own language, I had a PhD student. I was on his committee and he was working on speech pathology on the Navajo reservation because he's Dene himself, and he wanted to show, okay, what's normal for Navajo kids and what's abnormal, so that speech pathologists would actually be able to distinguish between normal Navajo English versus a kid with some sort of disordered speech. This is really important and gets kind of lost because people want children to have only the standard English. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that he pointed out to me is that class, the word class, like I'm going to class, is pronounced class by many Navajo English speakers. Yeah. So it's a tl sound, which hard to describe, but it's a very different sound from the k, l sounds. So anyway, I just thought that was interesting, and
it sounds better.
I mean, it's one of my favorite sounds, class, and you don't get to use it in English.
Well, and it's really important that he's pointing those things out, because if someone was ignorant to what Navajo English looks like, then they might see that as, a symptom of disorder. If they put all these things together incorrectly, it tells a different story.
Exactly. That's exactly what he was trying to say.
That's really important. Important work.
And in previous, generations previous to me who were learning English, there was certainly much more influence because they were first language speakers of different languages. Their English inventory would be different. So people in a lot of northern communities didn't make a distinction between S and esh. So shoes would be pronounced shoes. And but that's changed now because most people have English as their first language.
Yeah, that changes over time. Okay, so let's maybe switch to talking a little bit more about, Squamish, Kwakwala, other Indigenous languages that we want to talk about. So we already talked about Squamish, but what was it like learning Kwakwala?
Well, my dad's not a first language speaker of Squamish, and so I didn't grow up learning the language for him. We just kind of had some common words that we all knew, like posh for cat, and skumite for dog, and sahwa, because as a kid, you could say sahwa, which means to pee, so you could say it in public without, embarrassing your parents. And michin for head lice.
Oh, right.
These like small group of words that we all knew. There's some plants that we knew because we used to go and pick them, and so we knew the Squamish words for that. But in Kwakwala, though, my mom is a first language speaker, and everybody, all of her siblings and my grandparents, and so when we went to visit them, people didn't speak English unless they were talking to us, and so I was surrounded by the language in a much, much different way than Squamish. And I've done some immersion learning now in Kwakwala, and some of it is just feeling like things are getting unlocked. Like, oh yeah, that's what that word is, or that's how you say that. Like I'm not around it enough to have that all the time, but I think I'm somewhere farther along in Kwakwala in terms of exposure for my youth than Squamish by far.
Right.
However, like I said, in that generation, everybody was Kwakwala speakers. Now, when we're doing counts out of like 8,000 people, there's probably maybe 150 who are first language speakers. So that's changed drastically in the last 20 years.
Yeah, that shows just how quick these transitions can be.
Yeah.
These language shifts, as they're called.
Yeah, because when I was a kid, there's probably like a couple thousand,
Wow.
Right. So that leads us right into language revitalization, which is trying to stop that and turn the tide the other direction, get people to speak the Indigenous language again. So I know that you're involved with that. Do you want to talk about anything in particular, your research or a project that you're involved with?
Yeah, a lot of our communities started with language activities in the 70s, and it was very much mirrored with what was going on for French at the time, which was like 3 times a week for 20 or 30 minutes. And so then a lot of our communities got agreements from the school boards that we could teach our languages instead of French in elementary school. But of course, like anybody who's taken French away does not become a French speaker. Right. Anybody who takes their Indigenous language away also does not become a speaker of their language. And it becomes like a language appreciation type of activity, right? You become aware of it and gain some appreciation for the differences between languages, but you do not become a speaker. And since that time, though, like some communities, not a lot in BC, but a few have moved towards having their own immersion schools, like modeled somewhat after the French immersion schools here in Canada, and then just branching out with other immersion communities around the world who are doing similar things, like the Maoris in New Zealand and the Hawaiians in Hawaii have led the way in promoting immersion now. And so a lot of us are moving to immersion style teaching in many different ways, whether it's in elementary school or high school. And then a big movement that is happening right now is 2-year immersion programs for adults. And it's full-on immersion for like 1,800 hours over 2 years. And I don't know, was the American Army or whoever was recommending how many hours it would take to become like a conversational speaker of a language. And so people have been have been creating programs like this now. And a young guy in our Squamish community did that. Last year was the first year, and the students came out with the ability to have spontaneous conversations in the language with about things that they'd never talked about before.
That's awesome.
So that's happening in many places, and of course we want people to get even further. But the fact that we can get that far in a year says like it's not hopeless or impossible. It just requires dedication and the space and the money to do it, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a second cohort going through this year, and I just saw them the other week, and I saw them at the very beginning, and they were all like a little bit scared, and then a few weeks later, we're able to have some little conversations about stuff in Squamish, and they're not doing reading and writing, so it's not a literacy-based approach mostly.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of overview now where we're at. Like, we're actually finding, that the adults are really the important people right now in our communities, because they're the ones that are doing all the programming. They're the ones that are teaching. They're the ones that are developing resources, and including and putting myself in this group. Like, we are all additional language learners of our own Indigenous language. For me, it's like Squamish is like my fourth language that I've spent time learning, and so it's not even my second one. So we feel very positive about the possibilities now. Like, we just struggled so long and trying to do things in the school system, and there's still a good place for that, but we have to be realistic about how much language our youth are going to get out of an in-school program like that.
Right. And also, once there's lots of adults speaking, it makes it easier for children to speak it too, because there's more people for them to talk to.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's awesome.
Do you notice that are there people that are teaching their kids as the kids are babies and growing up? Is that happening at all?
There's not a lot of it yet. I was in a program called Mentor Apprentice, where I was the mentor, the speaker, and then there was a younger adult, and he was the apprentice. So we spent a lot of time, like hundreds of hours, just speaking Squamish and doing different activities, kind of unstructured. But his son would join us often, especially at the very beginning, and he would just he was not even 2 yet. So he's talking with his son, and when his son sees me, he'll make sure to say something in Squamish.
That's awesome.
But I was, the research though on bilingual families is kids need to have one other family where the parents and kids are using the language in order for the kids to spontaneously use it without being prompted. So that's the next step. Got to find another family to do that with, and then the kids will naturally just speak. That's our hope.
Right.
There is one of our students when I was out teaching at UVic. Him and his wife, I don't know, they hired or they worked with another young adult, and they became conversational speakers of Mohawk. And then they had kids, and they made an agreement to only speak Mohawk to their kids. And so their kids only speak Mohawk at home. They're the first language speakers of Mohawk in that particular community who lost all their speakers in the last 20 years or so. And so that's pretty exciting. And the kids are they're very strict, eh? So if they catch the parents slipping into English, and they'll say this in Mohawk, that language doesn't belong in this home. Speak Mohawk.
I love it. That's so great. That makes me happy.
So we wonder what they're thinking, but they're thinking that it's theirs, right? Which it is.
That's great.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's their language and it's their identity.
Yeah.
When I did some field work in Labrador, there was a girl who, I'm sure she did speak English, but she didn't speak English in front of me. She only spoke Innu Aiman in front of me, which was just awesome. Wow. I loved it. Gave me hope.
Yeah, so there's a real hunger in our communities for, I often get asked by people who don't know anything about what's going on, how do you get your youth involved? And I'm like, I don't think the question is how do we get them involved, because they're really hungry for, to know more about themselves, their history, and their language. It's fine being able to create opportunities for them where they can do that. And there's no way to do 1,800 hours of language learning unless someone's paying for that, for them to go through and have that experience, with the hopes, that they'll contribute to whatever else is coming in the future. But, so a lot of us are working with institutions like universities and colleges to create these type of programs that we can do double purpose. They'll get credits for it, but they also get the experience of becoming conversational speakers.
Hint, Trudeau, hint.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. So then would you say that there's a really supportive environment surrounding learning the Indigenous language as an adult?
In Canada, or in my community? Or?
I guess you could speak to your community. You see it being very supportive.
Yeah, so, I was talking about all of this schooling, this 3 times a week for 20 or 30 minutes, and how it didn't create speakers. But something we really know it did do is it changed the language attitudes of the community to be a very positive language attitude, because there was a lot of reluctance by the community 40 years ago because they were worried that the kids would be discriminated against like they were in residential school. And so people were ambivalent about it. People are not ambivalent now. It's really hard to find an ambivalent person in the community about should we revive our language. They're like, we should do it now, right? And our problem is like we're doing as much as we can, but we're just like a little group of people still. But we're starting to blossom a bit more and have a lot more different avenues for language learning and jobs even for people in the community.
That's great. Do you think outsiders and community members have different perspectives on revitalization? And I'm thinking outsiders like linguists that come in or anyone else that would come in to help with these efforts.
Keep the outsiders out.
I know, using the word outsider is making it kind of biased or something already when I ask.
Yeah, no, obviously, I mean, I have known Carrie for 20 years.
Right.
And we call upon her regularly for things that we can. And so we greatly value the support that we've got for many people in different institutions. That's one part. And also we have done different types of projects with museums in the city as a way of promoting knowledge about who we are, but it also is a way to develop language curriculum. And you'd be surprised by how many people in Vancouver have no idea, until recently, that there was First Nations that lived in the Vancouver area and where we lived.
Right.
Which just seems astounding to me that you could go to a country and not know who the Indigenous people are of that area. You know, that's not like that. The Olympics really changed that, and a lot of people know now. There's the Tsleil-Waututh and the Musqueam and the Squamish, that 3 First Nations in this area. But it didn't used to be like that.
That's true. I think the question was more like, outsiders like me have particular ideas about what needs to be done, although I've always been more careful about pushing anything on people because I think that's bad. But I think the perception is that outsiders often have an idea about how to revitalize the language, and Indigenous peoples have different ideas, which I think is true.
Sure. And of course, anybody that's not part of a community doesn't know how the community works.
Right.
And that goes for any community, right? Any small community and so forth. No one understands how people do things. And you don't know who all the people are and how the dynamics of the community work, right? You could never know that. And even when we're in the community, it doesn't mean we really know all those things all the time either, right? But like how to make decisions, like how to convince people to do stuff. You have to really rely on the community to get that done. Like how to say we're going to do a new project. When we did the dictionary, this is an example because it's an example of, we did a print dictionary and we published it through the University of Washington Press. And we worked with a number of people in our community and outside on that project. But within the community, we made sure to include as many different families and people as we could in the making of the dictionary. So when it came out and we had a community celebration, people were like, that's my grandmother's dictionary, or that's my uncle's dictionary. It wasn't like mine, and it certainly wasn't Carrie's, all of us who were doing all the background work, it didn't come out as ours, right? And we knew that as a community, like how to do that. And I think it would be really hard as a person outside the community, and even another Indigenous person, to know how it runs in Squamish, right? You just have to rely upon the people inside. One of my colleagues, Lorna Williams, she's really good at talking about this, and she does she's Lil'wat, which is a neighboring language to Squamish. And when she talks to Canadian public in general, she said, this is the heritage of all Canadians. These languages are the heritage of everybody. Yeah. And it'll make Canada a stronger and greater place to be if these languages are respected and promoted and they thrive, and it will be there will be benefits to everybody, right? Yes.
Yeah.
And she says it much better, but anyway, she's a real big advocate of like drawing in everybody that's willing to help, right?
Yeah, I think that's really important. Yeah. And then what was the other thing you wanted to talk about? Oh, prejudice.
Yes, please.
This is a really difficult, how do you even start?
Yeah,
this is what we say about Canadians is people like Americans going like, people are so polite in Canada. But you can be polite and racist at the same time. It's very easy to do.
Of course. I saw it. I also saw a really overt, horrible, not polite racism in Canada. But yes, we do polite racism very well, sadly.
That sounds like a terrible bumper sticker.
You're doing so well for your people. I don't know how many times I heard that. It's like, oh my God, please.
But that also, you will also hear that here in the United States too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure,
definitely.
sure.
You're very well spoken.
Thank you.
Oh, yes. So I guess a question we can ask is, what do you feel are some of the assumptions that folks might make if they hear a speaker of Res English?
Less educated.
Yeah.
That's certainly one of them. And I think whatever other kind of stereotypes they have about Indigenous people, that reinforces it for them, like.
Right. That's a really important point.
Lazy, unemployed, lacking motivation, whatever, all these, all those things that go along with prejudice against First Nations and Indigenous people in Canada.
Well, that makes the point that Carrie and I try to make in the podcast, that all of this is a proxy for racism or for ethnic discrimination, because the way that we speak, there's no way for you to know if the way I speak shows that I'm lazy. Like, you have no idea from the way that I speak, right? But that's the assumptions people make just from listening to folks. So it's all a proxy for this, these deeper embedded racist feelings.
Yeah.
For sure.
So why should you stop judging?
Because
you're
it's fucking racist.
Speak it.
Racist SOBs. About my own speech. And it's also not just the things we were talking about already, like intonation and lexical items, but the way you carry on a conversation.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It can really it can preclude many Indigenous people from being included in a conversation because of how turn-taking goes, and how pauses go. And I noticed this when I got into the university system, and of course I was more conscious of it, so I had to manipulate my own instinctive ways of talking, and then just keep jumping in and interrupting people. And it's like, oh God, this feels awful. But this is the only way I'm ever going to get something done, if I don't keep interrupting people. And it's like, so I had to give up something in order to talk in that situation. Because if I didn't, people would just assume that I was agreeing with everything. I'm like, no, we're just going to sit back and wait for everybody to get their thoughts out, and then we'll come and talk. But that, I realize that time is never coming. No one has that assumption about how our conversations are going. I'm going to have to change that in order to get my point across.
Yeah, that's a really good point that I hadn't thought about consciously when we were talking about this, but I have thought about it previously, that there's just a different way of communicating. I mean, you expect that. Different cultures have different ways of communicating, but white people like me have a tendency to forget.
So I think, along with the prejudice is also that, we don't have something to say, or we don't really have anything, we don't feel very confident about ourselves, and all these other things about because we're not doing the conversational style of most Canadians, I guess. I don't know if that's even true, but Carrie obviously said she's not like that, but it's different anyways, right?
I think this must tie into, I've heard the stereotype that Indigenous people are soft-spoken, so that must be kind of connected to that as well, do you think?
Yeah, it's definitely slower. To hear people talk fast sounds very strange. There are some people in the community who maybe didn't grow up in the community, and they talk really fast, and everybody's trying to get them to breathe or something. Yeah, that's one thing. So the speed is definitely different.
I hadn't really thought of the soft-spoken thing. To me, that's very individual. I mean, yeah. At least in my experience, that doesn't mean that the prejudice doesn't exist or the bias, but I've never had that thought.
Okay.
You know, I know this is very Canadian specific, but I'm sure there's parallels in the States too. I've been telling people whenever I get a chance, you know, you need to let decision makers in your community, whether that's politicians and others, to know that you're aware that there's language revitalization going on and you support it. And if there's legislation, you support that. Because people in power assume that if no one says anything, that no one cares, right? You know, and once people, this is my experience, once people know what we're doing and that like, they might imagine it's a hopeless cause at first, but then they hear all the cool things that have happened and they're very excited. Like, how could I know more about that? So even learning more about what's going on in your local communities, because our argument about language revitalization is all these languages grew up in a local area, and wherever you're living is a local area of a language that is probably a group of people are seeking to revive it and to become, you know, at least aware of that and acknowledge it. You know, that's not a small step for the greater cause. That if people know and acknowledge that, and then find out, you know, there's, I don't know, in the differences in the communities, some of us are much further ahead than others, and some communities really need a lot of outside help, and that could be advocacy of some sort in helping people to make those next steps, right? In terms of prejudice, this is always true. People who have prejudice, as soon as they get to know people, it gets much harder to carry on with any kind of generalized statements about Indians or, you know, or about people living on the res or all of these, you know, these things. And there's those, most First Nations communities I know here in this area of the world do many things that are open to the public in general, people to come and participate and join in and get to learn. Because it's not about having like a set of things like you should be doing. It's like learning how we learned by being with each other and hanging out and doing things together. And then people really incorporate that into their lives sometimes here. And I think that maybe people don't realize the openness of the local First Nations communities and Indigenous communities in their area that most of us are.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think most people don't realize that, yeah, there are things you can participate in. There are some things that you can't, but many things you can. So that's a good point. I hadn't thought of that. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's probably good. I think we covered a lot of ground.
That was great. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Peter, for joining us. This was really awesome.
Thanks, Peter.
Chen kurman tomi up to know up say to an hot squeak at these states. I'm very happy to have this good conversation with you, my friends, today.
Oh, thank you. How do I say thank you?
Hoichua.
Hoichua.
Hoichua?
Hoichua.
Hoichua.
Yeah,
close.
I'm going to try harder for the next time I talk to you, Peter.
Okay, and don't be an asshole.
Do not be an asshole, y'all. All right.
Bye.
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 The Vocal Fries podcast is produced by Chris Ayres for Halftone Audio. Theme music by Nick Granum. You can find us on Tumblr, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Vocal Fries Pod. You can email us at vocalfriespod@gmail.com.